What's going on, YouTube fam? You're tuned in to the Wealth Investing Network. We do this for the win. Today we're talking about why Warren Buffett sold TSM or TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing stock. This is a company where if you've been holding it for a little while, more long-term investor style, you've been doing pretty well, but it's been a bit rocky over the past year and a half. It hit highs of about $140, dipped down to as low as about $60, and around that time, I made my previous video when Warren Buffett bought the stock. And I noted then that Taiwan Semiconductor is a very important company because it manufactures the chips for a lot of the very well-known companies that we know and love that do well in the stock market, that you have a lot of their products: Apple, Google, Nvidia, Microsoft, Tesla. These companies design their chips, but then they send those designs to Taiwan to have them made, to have them manufactured. And while this stock was sliding, I thought the company wasn't getting a lot of credit for how much it really does in the market and was potentially undervalued at that time. I actually own this stock in my portfolio. You should do your own research. For now, you're just watching a guy on the internet who's not a financial advisor. But thank you for tuning in with me today. So it hit that $60 low back in November, and then mid-November, these articles started coming out. Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway discloses a $4.1 billion stake in TSMC. It seems to go along with a quote that's often attributed to him: be fearful when others are greedy, and be greedy when others are fearful. There was a lot of fear about the semiconductor industry. We saw PC demand slump. There were a lot of fears of recession, things of that nature. But Warren Buffett buying the stock seemed to have brought the bulls back. And so that brings us back to the question of why did he sell? Warren Buffett says the threat of war is a consideration in his decision to dump the bulk of his $4 billion stake in TSMC. But I think that threat of war as a consideration probably wasn't the main factor. And we're going to go into the financials. I'm going to talk about why I think that. And we can talk about the financials because they recently reported their Q1 earnings. It was interesting to see before earnings, some analysts were upgrading the stock. People were noting key items to watch. And I think on that list of key items to watch wasn't necessarily war. We all know what's happening with Taiwan and China. But it is relevant because we talked about the CHIPS Act before. We talked about how the United States government is basically going to give money to companies who are producing chips in the U.S. TSMC does have an Arizona plant that they're working on right now, and they want $15 billion in government aid for its U.S. chips plant. But they call some of the Biden administration's conditions unacceptable. The U.S. is saying, well, we're not just writing blank checks to these companies. They kind of are. I understand why politically they wouldn't want to admit that. But part of their stipulations are there are rules that require the company to share some of its profits with the U.S. government if returns exceed projections. So if they say we're going to make X amount of money on this plant and they make way more than that, politically that would make the U.S. government look bad, so they would want to claw back some of that money. But for the CEO of a company, of course he wants to make excessive profits. And those aren't the only conditions. We were talking about China and that relevancy because recipients of money from the U.S. government are also constrained from expanding chip manufacturing in countries of concern, which includes China. TSM does have some operations in China. They call them legacy operations, but it's a small part of their business. But that brings it back to Warren Buffett and considering war as part of his decision because the U.S. and China are ramping up tensions. But again, I think a consideration doesn't mean the consideration. I did see some articles talking about how recession may be a bigger issue. I'm a numbers guy, so let's get into the numbers. They did have a weaker Q1 2023 performance. Now, for brevity's sake, I'm going to talk about it mostly in terms of US dollars. They do report their earnings in terms of the Taiwan currency. So when you see numbers like revenue actually did expand by about 3%, you could turn to another article that's talking about US dollars and it actually fell 4%. But even with the new Taiwan dollar, performance did decline 18% quarter over quarter. And you know things are declining when their expectations for their capital expenditures are changing. The company's noting we need to spend a little less money to stay as profitable as we want to be. The chief executive of the company noted in the earnings call that the results were hurt by softening in-market demand, while inventory levels were much higher than expected, and that could extend to the third quarter. Okay, I'm going to really get into the numbers now, so let's back up a bit. Let's rewind to the end of 2022, right? Q4, they actually had net revenue in US dollars close to $20 billion. But then their guidance for the next quarter, the first quarter of 2023, the report they just released now, they're guiding much lower, from almost $20 billion to somewhere in the $16-17 billion range. So they kind of give a little bit of a heads up months before, and that slide in the stock already happened. Okay, let's fast forward a little bit. Now we're in the present, Q1 of 2023. Their actual numbers just met their guidance once again in that $16-17 billion revenue mark for the quarter. But now their guidance for Q2 of 23 is even lower, in the $15 to $16 billion range. Now, we go to their financial statements. I don't want to spend too much time on this for a couple of reasons. One, because it's going to appear very small to you, and you may or may not be able to read a lot of this. From a balance sheet perspective, this company's always been strong. It's still strong. Cash and cash equivalents are about $45 billion that they have in cash. Compare that to bonds payable, their debts essentially, sitting about $28 billion. Now, when you get into their income statement, that's a little different. Again, this is very small print. Again, we've got this new Taiwan dollar kind of confusing things a little bit. I'm not even going to look at year over year because of the currency transitions. But again, for net revenue, we see that familiar number that we talked about in the guidance already, so I'm not going to review that again. And there's nothing much to note with operating expenses, so we'll talk about net income and drag that down to the cash flow statement, which is what I find more interesting. Let's round up, call that $13 billion. As investors, this is the profit. This is what we focus on. This is where the return on investment can come from, but there's a few things that have to happen first. We talked about how they had dramatically adjusted their 2023 capital expenditure. They're lowering this. Why are they lowering this? Because they're expecting lighter cash flow. $13 billion gets eaten up very quickly. We're looking at this quarter, property, plant, and equipment close to $10 billion. Then we scroll down. Another thing this company has to do, they pay a dividend. Well, that's $2 billion. There's some other stuff here, but those are the big ticket items. Basically, this money gets eaten up quickly, and they're saying, hey, maybe we're going to be a little light. Hey, U.S. government, we want $15 billion. We're not rocking with your conditions because we're not giving up the dividend. And I think that brings it back a little bit to Warren Buffett. I think the dividend is safe. Reading the tea leaves, I don't think Warren Buffett's worried about the dividend. Again, we talked about this company is flush with cash, but a company doesn't want to necessarily burn through their cash because then you get in a situation like Intel. But I think it's interesting that at a time where they need to invest back in their business, these dividends, this $2.3 billion is money that could be used towards the plant in Arizona. But shareholders are expecting this dividend. And there's this rock and a hard place between investing in your business and pleasing shareholders. Now, looking into the stock chart, we can add in some lines. We can look at the 200-day moving average. This could have been entering an uptrend, but there's a certain level around where it is right now that it needs to hold. Zooming in a little bit, the last time I talked about this stock on the channel, I had drawn these red lines, adding a green line here to show a weaker uptrend. There was a gap up when the report about Warren Buffett buying the stock came out, and maybe another gap up, but I don't really know what's holding this trend up because everything we're seeing from the financials, from some of the CEO statements, there's a potential for things to kind of come up light. Their clients, the big players, Apple, Microsoft, all these companies are expected to have some struggles clearing inventory, which would mean a Q2 sales drop for TSMC. Even with the boom in AI that everybody's talking about, it doesn't mean that they're having a bunch of chips manufactured right now at the pace that some of the stocks might imply. I have some concern that this level may not hold. Maybe the market will wait for earnings for some of these companies to kind of get an indication of recession fears, things of that nature. But Warren Buffett already got in, got out, bought low, sold high, and that's pretty much the end of it. Let me know in the comments if you think he made a smart move, if you think TSMC can hold this level that it's at right now, or if it's going to fall back to the lows it was at before Warren Buffett bought the stock. This is the end of the video, and you know I tell you a secret at the end. Today's secret is that I'm about to get on a plane tomorrow morning. Last night I got about 3 hours of sleep. I'm probably going to get about 3 hours of sleep tonight before I have to get up and drive to the airport and all that stuff. But I'm here with you guys making a video because I'm trying to have some dedication, and hopefully that will lead to some greater success in this space. Wish me luck. Comment below, all the things. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next one.